So these down here are not houseboats. They are floating homes.
A quirk of Portland, Oregon. A few hundred houses anchored relatively permanently on this island north of town.
Yours is built on top of dirt. These homes float on top of the Columbia River.
But there's a problem. Some of these floating homes are right in the way of a highway expansion.
I've been all around the country. I had never heard of floating homes until I got here.
It's Greg Johnson's job to lead a team who are trying to make the impossible happen. Fix Interstate 5 between the states of Oregon and Washington, which is kind of a big deal because 3 million people only have 2 bridges. A modern one that's about 40 years old that carries Interstate 205, and this one, the I-5 bridge, that just turned 108 years old. And the last time the 2 states tried to replace it, they spent 9 years and $175 million on engineers, architects, geologists, archaeologists, planners, everything necessary to plan out a mega project, only for Oregon to hate the road widening part and Washington hate light rail so much, the state Senate backed out and the whole deal fell apart.
So about a year ago, we talked about all the problems with this old bridge.
It might look really cool, but it's not very cool to drive on. Only 3 squishy lanes in each direction, and nowhere to go if you break down. An elevator for tall ships that stops the entire freeway. And if you try to avoid traffic and take your bike,
This walkway is not great.
and Portland's giant light rail system is stuck at the shoreline. So anybody living on the Washington side pretty much has to drive.
2 states divided by a very large river, communities that see themselves somewhat differently.
So here we go again. Can Portland and Vancouver bridge their differences with a little help from the team committed to make sure history doesn't repeat itself?
This is the 20-year story of 2 states trying to replace this old bridge, and why this time might actually happen.
Our problem is they are right next to the interstate.
The Jantzen Beach floating home community is just one of hundreds of issues a mega project has to sensitively deal with if they want to get the project built.
Jantzen Beach here on Hayden Island has kind of gone out of business twice.
The island sits in the middle of the Columbia River, just off the Oregon shoreline.
A century ago, right over there was the Coney Island of the West.
During the 1930s, 25,000 people a day would come to ride roller coasters, and by the 1960s, Interstate 5 rolled right past the front door, which meant the only way on and off the island was the freeway.
Floods, fires. By the 1970s, a shopping center developer tore it all down and built a big enclosed mall over there.
But even it's now gone out of business. Blame it on the traffic, I guess. Today, it's a big box development, but one that's starting to see a little bit of vacancy itself. So if you're going to build a multi-billion-dollar highway project that runs right through the middle of the island, now's the time to get it right.
Sort of a make or break, so Jantzen Beach doesn't go out of business a third time.
Well, now it's 4:07. You get traffic and weather.
People say, well, my voice doesn't matter. They're going to do what they're going to do.
This used to be true. Before 1970, one small team of engineers could just draw a line on a map, and construction crews would start building. But history has shown us that when a small group of people just do things without any input, they usually end up making some colossal mistakes. So Congress passed a law that said, hey, taxpayers are footing the bill. They should have some say on what gets built.
If you make changes to a road and there's federal money involved, rules say you have to document the impacts. They call that an environmental impact statement. And I just saw this on the side of I-5. Public comment period open. Getting involved with the community and finding out what they want. If you're doing the project right, it's a lot more than just a formality.
So a decade ago when Oregon and Washington tried to build a bridge, the design had it landing on Hayden Island and spreading out to 22 lanes, which is a little eye-opening for the residents. Thankfully, public involvement picked up on this.
We listened. They said they wanted a smaller footprint, and they also wanted a way to access the Portland street grid without going on the freeway.
So through small meetings and big ones like this one, residents worked with the team to redesign the interchange. Traffic to and from Oregon would use this new city street bridge instead. The freeway can still move a lot of traffic without being quite so wide on the island, and it might save a few of those floating homes as well. But that's just the first of many issues.
We can save people time by adding new lanes. Plus, it would save $2 billion, including the need for tolling.
We have a lot of folks on the Washington side who are convinced that building more lanes is the answer. Or on the south side, they're saying, no, we want a smaller bridge as possible.
Good with the bridge replacement. We'd love to see a whole lot less freeway and asphalt in this project.
And this cultural divide may have played a role in tanking the last serious effort to replace this bridge about 10 years ago.
It's different here. 94.7 Alternative Portland.
Back in 2005, both states started public involvement, and the Columbia River Crossing team, well, they looked at pretty much everything. Building a third bridge somewhere else, building just a transit bridge, digging a tunnel, or doing nothing at all. And after probably about 1,000 meetings, came up with this design. The federal government would pay for the transit, tolls would pay for half of the freeway component, and the states of Oregon and Washington would put up $450 million each. Oregon approved their money, Washington didn't. And that killed the project, until now. I suppose putting a multi-billion-dollar road project together is kind of like balancing a tightrope. If one side gets everything they want, nobody gets anything at all. The project may have died, but the need for the bridge hasn't gone away. In 2019, all the parties came back together to try again on the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. And thankfully, attitudes in the Northwest have seemed to be changing. How? Well, maybe.
Just another decade of having to drive on this thing or not have light rail on this thing has softened everybody up.
So the goal now, salvage as much of that $175 million worth of work from the Columbia River Crossing project, update it, and push it across the finish line.
Some things have changed in the 10 years since that program went dormant. Now we have both states have put up $1 billion committed to this effort.
The challenge now is not to balance two things, it's to balance like 100 different things, starting with the fight between cars and transit. This video is not sponsored by Addiction King. Drain that paycheck on your drive home from work using promo code NEXTTIME for sure. When it comes to public involvement, those behind the wheel have no small voice.
Over here on the Washington side, they just see economic activity grinding to a halt. It's important to keep an economy going, and think about all the trucks moving between states that pass through here. Well, if you're going to widen it in a growing region, they might argue we should make it 10 lanes in each direction, right?
We can't build more through lanes to move people because we'd be ripping out half of downtown Vancouver or Fort Vancouver.
North of the bridge, the freeway sort of threads a needle between the downtown and the historic side. So it's not exactly like you can double the size of the freeway, because I don't think the National Park Service went to all this trouble to build all these replicas just to rip it out for a freeway widening. But even if Washington had the space to double the size of the freeway and build a big new bridge to match, it really doesn't do much good on the Oregon side. Portland freeways just aren't built to handle that much traffic.
Just a few miles south of the bridge, and the freeway bottlenecks.
Most freeways in the region are 3 lanes each direction, but here it drops down to just 2 lanes.
They want to widen the freeway back to 3 lanes for the mile or 2 stretch here, and in exchange they'll build a big park on top of it so the freeway sort of disappears into a tunnel.
And that's all this section of I-5 will ever be. 3 lanes, if it can get built.
But to a group of Oregonians, they're actually suing the project to try to stop it.
And that's Oregon for you. You're never going to see big, giant Texas or California-sized freeways here.
So the plan is to just maintain the 3 lanes they have now. They're not adding a 4th or 5th lane. So no widening. Except they are widening because they have to add shoulders, right? Because right now if your car breaks down, you're in a crash, or something, get a flat tire, there's nowhere to put your car, and so automatically you're stalled in the lane and you're creating a traffic jam. So those are going in. And they're also adding something called an auxiliary lane. And for some Oregonians, that gets a little controversial.
If you look at the name of the project, it's the Interstate Bridge Replacement. If you watch that video, how much of that is the bridge? There's 5 miles of widening and there's a mile of bridge in there. This is not a bridge replacement. This is a 5-mile freeway expansion.
It was never just a bridge project. That's one of the misnomers.
Partly to fix the old 1950s freeway design.
This is not great because you have your 3 tight lanes and then all of a sudden, bloop, you got to rush over to take an exit. But now imagine an on-ramp doing this. It gets 10 times worse.
Modern freeways try to space the on and off ramps about a mile apart from each other, but we don't have that here. The merging space between ramps near the interstate bridge are much, much shorter than this.
7 interchanges so closely spaced, and people diving in and folks in through lanes having to stomp on the brakes to allow them to get into the flow of traffic.
And so the rationale is, well, what's the point of spending billions on a brand new bridge bridge if the traffic right next to it immediately just jams up. And an engineer's tool to help fix this is the auxiliary lane.
See this blue car here? They've got to merge over real quick because that lane is going away and all the traffic's having to slow down to let them in. Now imagine we added a new lane as you come on the freeway here, and that new lane runs all the way to the next exit. Well, now they have all that time to decide when it's good to get merged over.
If I only want to go from interchange to interchange, I don't ever have to get into that flow of through traffic, and it disrupts how those folks are moving.
We have a tendency to build aux lane connecting to aux lane connecting to aux lane. But if you have 5 miles of auxiliary lanes, you have added an additional lane.
Well, if you can get on at Marine Drive and get all the way to 4th Plane, that feels like a through trip to me.
As strongly as freeway widening opponents feel, none appear ready to tank the project over it, as long as there aren't too many new auxiliary lanes.
I know many partners have been very clear that 1 is the most that is acceptable to them and that 2 opens the negotiation again. I would add my name to that list.
So I guess that's progress. We were debating between 12 and 10 last time. Now we're debating between 10 and 8.
But being an interstate highway, cars will be a compelling part of the decision-making here.
There's a certain philosophy that, we'll punish people out of their cars. Now, if someone can show me anywhere in the United States where that has worked, I'm interested.
So how does this all balance out with people who ride transit?
Right now, the Max Light rail trains stop about a block from the start of the Columbia River over there because there's no room, obviously, on the bridge to carry light rail trains into Washington. In fact, there's not even room to carry these vehicles onto Hayden Island.
And in almost every iteration of the bridge, adding some light rail tracks to connect in another 500,000 residents really just makes too much sense.
We have one opportunity to get light rail across this river. If we don't do it now, it will never happen.
The way the plans look right now, a brand new bridge just for the train would carry this to Hayden Island, where there'd be a stop at Jantzen Beach. It would then join the big new bridge into Washington, where there'd be stops at the waterfront and then one at Evergreen Boulevard.
And that's where Washingtonians get their biggest present of all.
From that final Max station, people would walk out here over I-5 onto a big city park that would connect the downtown side with the Fort Vancouver side. That's called a freeway cap. It's like a little tunnel that all the cars would drive underneath.
And it connects the city back in a more meaningful way to Fort Vancouver.
This is a project this city really wants, probably could never afford to do it. Would be a huge, cool project in and of itself, but it's almost a tiny footnote, a little detail. Gives you an idea of just how enormous this Interstate Bridge Replacement Program project is.
And having tens of thousands of passengers hopping on and off of trains all day long next to Vancouver Central Business District, well, that's got to be good for economic development. And you can ride from one downtown to the other and stay in the same seat. And that's enough to win over some of the highway expansion skeptics.
I am willing to stomach a lot in order to get light rail into Vancouver. That is one of the North Stars of this project.
But even if the federal government picks up the cost for construction, somebody has to pay to operate this thing. The service would still be Oregon's TriMet. Once rail cars touch ground in Washington State, and that stirs up a little territorialism.
When they beg it from Olympia, they're saying, can we get everybody in the state of Washington out of the general fund to pay the costs demanded by another state?
How exactly would they pay for it? Well, you'll be thrilled with this. Raise taxes.
Certainly a sensitive topic, because Washington State getting cold feet on light rail is part of what tanked the project last time, which delayed the project for everybody, including those driving cars. Of course, on a bigger project, you have to talk about money and the word tolling, which has people scared. Are they going to toll the old bridge? Are they going to put a toll on the 205 bridge? Well, yes and no. I don't think anybody likes the word toll, but mega projects are incredibly expensive. And whether it's the Golden Gate Bridge or the Lincoln Tunnel, tolling unlocked the money to make it happen. In fact, the very first span of the old Interstate Bridge tolled nickels from drivers. And when they built the second span in 1958, tolls paid for that too. In fact, drivers paid it off early in just 8 years. So there are certainly historic examples that the new bridge would use tolls to pay for it too. But tolling will start on the old bridges the moment the project is approved. The price of the toll would stay low at night, so perhaps as low as $0 on the old bridge, and then that price would start bumping up higher and higher during the day to keep traffic flowing on the new bridge so it doesn't jam up. It also means some drivers will start using Interstate 205 instead, because that bridge is free. Now, planners had considered putting a toll on that bridge too, But Washington State passed a law making that illegal, and Oregon's DOT tells a local TV station they have no plans to toll the 205 bridge.
With all the potential for disagreement, there are like two things everybody agrees on. One, this old bridge is bad because even in a moderate earthquake, we're all going down into the river.
Especially the century-old lift towers. And on that point...
Two, anytime a boat that's slightly too tall has to come by, they have to shut the entire freeway down and lift this section up in the air. It stops everybody.
So what does a mega project do about those really tall ships? Well, they could just build another bridge with an elevator.
We're studying it in earnest to make sure we know all of the problems or ins and outs if a movable span is required, but that is not the desire of the users at this location.
Now, don't get me wrong, the mechanical intricacy of this lift is pretty amazing. But
there are certain things you want to be unique at and number one at. Movable span is not one of them.
And so if we're serious about getting rid of these terrible lifts, then this bridge has got to be taller, right? It's got to be a lot taller.
The current bridge will open to 178 feet. We have not had a need for that height of opening for approximately 10 years. But when they do need it, they need it.
So I'd say, well, the sky's the limit. Just build the bridge really tall so all the ships can go underneath it, right? But there's a problem. There's an airfield right here.
So what about the people who fly airplanes? And who in their right mind would put a tall bridge right next to an airport anyway?
We are grandfathered in because that bridge is so old. It preceded Pearson Airfield and PDX. So we can't build the awe-inspiring cable stay or suspension bridge because, once again, we'd be poking up into that airspace.
And this pits airplanes and boats against each other.
It becomes a vertical sandwich, right? Because you want 178 feet down below for ships to clear it. But that pushes you into airspace for planes. And then the plane stuff pushes it back down. Well, at one point 10 years ago, they were down to only 95 feet of vertical clearance for ships, which was definitely not enough.
It looks like boats and planes might be able to settle on 116 feet. But even at this compromise height, it's still not tall enough for the biggest boats.
Here's where they get really clever. Instead of fixing the bridge to accommodate the tallest possible ship that might need to go underneath, what if instead they identify and find the tallest ships that do go underneath and then work with their owners to try to shorten them a little bit to fit under 116 feet?
We have 5 ships that would have to be altered. Either their antennas are too high or they have cranes or booms on those vehicles that would have to be altered.
So for instance, one of the companies that fabricates and builds large objects here and sometimes wants to float it down the river, what about moving them down past the new bridge so that way they don't ever have to go underneath it?
Can you take a part of your business and move it on the downstream side and put the big things together, and then you have no restrictions further up?
And they won't have to worry about new factories bringing in new ships. Pretty much anywhere east of town is the Columbia River Gorge.
Dams and locks that restrict the size of vessels that can go on the river.
And the turnoff for the Port of Portland is long before the bridge.
You're not going to see big container ships. Those type of ships don't go this far up the Columbia.
Okay, so what about the people who need to drive on this bridge while construction crews are spending a decade tearing it down and building a new one?
Going to want to keep the old one open as long as they can. Now, if they build the new bridge off to the side this way, it starts getting into Fort Vancouver and the airport there.
So plans show the new bridge drifting toward the west. And for Jantzen Beach, that's pretty serendipitous.
So we're standing a little bit to the west of the old bridge on the side of what used to be a hotel that a while back, I guess somewhat coincidentally, burned down.
Flames raced through the old Red Lion Hotel in 2012, and thankfully the shopping center they wanted to replace the hotel with fell through, which makes the perfect launch point to push the bridge into Vancouver.
Once the new bridge hits shore here on the Washington side, it'll land just west of the existing bridge, and then it curves to line up with I-5 right behind you.
And by the time you add in the light rail, all the car lanes, a bicycle trail.
One of the downsides, it becomes tremendously wide.
If they go double-decker, they can shave 100 feet off of that width to get it down to 170 feet.
The design from a decade ago put car traffic on the top level. The lower deck had a light rail and a big wide pedestrian and bicycle trail. And being on the lower deck helped keep people out of the rain. So what about the people walking or riding their bikes who are scared that they're going to get mugged or something because they're on the bottom level of a double-decker bridge?
I have not met any pedestrian or cyclist who wants to be in a cage underneath traffic.
They think that, okay, I won't have eyes on me, and there's a potential for incidents away from the viewing of the general public.
They might find allies from the fire department.
So what do you do if, heaven help you, you have a MAX train halfway across the river and it breaks down, or there's a medical emergency, or heaven help us, there's a fire, right? Because you can't exactly hop in your fire truck and drive on railroad tracks.
The type of vehicles that the railroads use that have the wheels that can go on tracks and have regular rubber tires as well. We would have to have vehicles like that for emergency access. The IBR program would have to fund that type of equipment probably in perpetuity.
Even more reason to sour on double-decker. The structure gets really complicated. In the Columbia River Crossing final report, the engineers investigating really criticized this shape between the top and lower deck, called an open web box girder design. It's pretty experimental. Normally a box girder design is hollow in the middle, but you only use the top part of it. This would use the inside as well, but they make the sides this really complicated see-through pattern to keep users on the lower deck from feeling claustrophobic. And the investigating engineers said with enough time and money they could make this work, but honestly construction quality would just be better if they did something more conventional. Which means on the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program, if they do double-decker, it's going to be metal trusses.
Truss bridges have to be painted eventually. They have a lot of bolting that has to be inspected. You do have to have folks going up there looking at it, making sure those girders are not cracking or rusting or doing all other deleterious things that girders do.
It looks likely that a single level, therefore, is going to win out. Keep bikes and pedestrians happy, and make the engineering of the design a little simpler.
If they can make the new bridge flat, all one level,
now you open up bridge-type possibility.
There are hundreds of little details that make a difference. For instance, the new bridge, you're going to be a lot higher up in the air when you're walking or biking and you hit the shore over here.
So getting people down in a comfortable way is going to be a challenge.
So right now they're playing with the idea of having a big looping ramp. That way, one, it's not a slip and slide on a rainy day, and two, it's compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act for people in wheelchairs. But there are some people who get really wound up about having to go around this big circuitous route. They just want to get there directly.
That led a guy named Bob to post this on the site formerly known as Twitter, poking fun at the design.
And Greg tells me those are the kinds of details that get people upset.
Stop picking up stones to throw at us. Pick up pencils and help us design a modern facility that meets the needs of cyclists, walkers, rollers in this corridor.
If you think about it, it's not really a surprise that a $7 billion project would have so many people pitted against each other. Engineering has always been about trying to strike a reasonable balance.
All the public involvement that the federal government requires should never have been a cynical hoop for engineers and planner staff to jump through. This is the process of how those that are stewards of our tax dollars and deliver projects to us get the information they need so they can actually build the thing that we want, and then, filter some of our crazier desires through the lens of engineering and planning best practices. By the way, I asked Greg, what's one overlooked feature that he gets really geeky and excited about? And it turns out it's the drains.
We have over 190 acres of non-permeable surface that just drains stormwater runoff directly into the Columbia River. We're going to solve that problem.
Instead, rainwater will pipe over to two large detention ponds on the Oregon side. That's where a complicated set of layers will pull all the junk out of the water.
Filter out the micro rubber fibers from tires, all the oils and other fluids.
This well thought out but always imperfect project will be better for the ecology than what we currently have. Better for drivers than what we currently have. Much better for transit users than what we currently have. And walking or riding your bike, a whole lot better than what we currently have. The new bridge will be better, even if nobody is getting exactly what they want.
So how soon could this project practically happen? Well, most optimistic path, Greg says, He's hoping to see shovels in the ground by the end of 2025 with all the federal approvals they need, and Oregon and Washington happy. And at that point, they would turn from a planning organization, they're in that building over there, into a construction delivery organization.
We want to see local contractors who have worked and plied their trade in both states for years. We want to make sure that they see themselves in this construction, and it's not just the multinational firms coming in and doing all of the work.
As you think about it, there's a contract for the bridge, and there's a contract for the approach roads to the bridge, and there's a contract for the light rail component. There are a lot of contracts. So even once this does get up and going, might be looking at a decade for it to all get done. But that'll be fun to watch, right? I know I'll be watching. I'll see you next time.
Now, hey, if you just sat through 25 minutes about the Interstate Bridge, you probably want to know more. Check out my monthly Patreon-exclusive podcast. Comes out on the first of each month. This month, a longer cut with my interview with Greg Jantzen of the Interstate Bridge Replacement Program. A little behind-the-scenes talk. We check out this month's transportation news headlines, which includes congestion pricing drama.